Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Blake's Books. Today I have another book review for you for a very popular fantasy book that I'm sure if you're watching this you've probably read, and that is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, the first book of the Lord of the Rings. This is my first time rereading this trilogy. I decided to end the year of 2023. I was going to reread this trilogy because it's been about 2 years since I first read it, which is not a long time, but I've read a lot of books since I read this trilogy. I wanted to see how it holds up now that I've read a lot of other stuff. And it's been one of my favorite trilogies ever since I first read it. And it was like the first major adult fantasy thing that I ever read, because I figured if I was going to start somewhere, I ought to start with Lord of the Rings. And I wanted to give it another try and see what I think of it now. And I reread The Hobbit over the summer, I think around July-ish, maybe August, I can't remember. And I enjoyed that quite a bit as well. I really enjoyed reading Fellowship of the Ring again. There's a lot of really cool stuff that I'm kind of getting a little bit more now because I've become a little more familiar with the Middle-earth world and things like that. So there's little tidbits of things here and there that I notice, and it's been fun. So to get into some good stuff with this book, obviously this book's popular for a reason. It's The Lord of the Rings. It's like crazy big. I think that's for good reason. The world building in this book is excellent, done very well, I think, in most places. I love the world of Middle-earth as well. Not just in The Lord of the Rings, but in The Hobbit and the Silmarillion and everything. And I think it's such a cool world, and I think this book does a good job of conveying that world to the reader. I really enjoy just the feeling of this book. I got several points in this book where I was kind of thinking to myself, this is just a nice, comforting book to read. It was just enjoyable, and I don't really know how else to put it other than to say it was just comforting to me. It's just something that I could sit down with and just read it and have a good time. I just love the feel and the tone of the book. It has the whole, just being nice kind of thing going for it. But it's also got this very epic feel to it. In some ways, particularly in terms of the lore that is hinted at in this book. I think the book itself doesn't quite carry the epic feeling that I typically would associate with Lord of the Rings. I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion or anything, but it doesn't quite feel as big and epic as I tend to think of Lord of the Rings as. But the world definitely gets that feeling across to me. And all of that stuff, and it just has this adventurous, fun feel to it, especially towards the beginning of this book, because a lot of the beginning of this book takes place kind of in the Shire and things like that, which is just fun. The way the story unfolds, the whole quest being given of, taking the ring and taking it to Mordor and everything. And there's just a lot of ideas, I guess, in this book and in Lord of the Rings in general that I really like. For example, I love the Nazgul. I think that is such a fascinating idea. Sauron himself is really cool and interesting, even though he is very much kind of the stereotypical Dark Lord. I think he's the golden example of that for a reason. I really like the way that his presence is conveyed in this book. It works with a lot of tropes, but a lot of them are tropes that I like. I love the Dark Lord trope. I love the wise old wizard trope. The quest trope can maybe be a little hit or miss, I think. But it's one that I like here. And obviously, this book kind of set the standard in terms of fantasy tropes in a lot of ways. So the fact that it is tropey isn't, an issue or anything. It's just a thing that exists in it. Getting a little more into negatives now, not hugely, because I don't have a lot of negative things to say about this book really, but I do think that part 2 of this book, or book 2 as it's referred to in the book, but I'm going to say part 2 just to make things a little less confusing considering this is a multi-book series. Part 2 was not as interesting to me, although I did really enjoy the sequence in Moria quite a lot, which I'm going to kind of mention some plot things about this book that, I assume if you are watching this, you're probably familiar, at least in passing, with Lord of the Rings. I'm not going to delve deeply into spoilers or anything, because that's not typically what I do unless I'm specifically discussing spoilers, but I will mention things that you will probably be aware of. But the first part is from the beginning until they reach Rivendell, and then the second part is the Rivendell arrival until the Fellowship breaks up. Part 1 I thought was really excellent. I really loved. I thought it was a lot of fun and very enjoyable, even though a lot of it was very slow-paced. This book in general, I'd say, is pretty slow-paced, but I think especially the beginning in the Shire is just, very kind of slice of life with a lot of the hobbits and things like that. I actually really enjoyed that. But then you get into part 2, which I felt was not as engaging to me for some reason. I'm not really sure why, but it just didn't quite grab me as much. Although I did really enjoy the sequence in Moria. That was maybe my favorite section of the book, aside from the part in the Shire. But I really enjoyed, the first half of this book, or a little more, however long it is, and the sequence in Moria. But a lot of part 2 just kind of dragged a little bit for me. I still enjoyed it, but it was not as great to me. And I think that was also the case when I first read this book, so I guess things haven't changed too much in regards to that. I do also think one thing that is very prevalent in Lord of the Rings is songs and poems, which it's totally fine if you're into that, but I don't really care about that stuff. There's some cool little bits of lore in the songs and poems that are nice, but I'm not a poetry guy. I don't really like reading them. And granted, it's not as prevalent in here as I remembered it being. The way that I remembered it, it was like it's every 3 pages, but it's not that often in this book. But still, it's one of those things where it's like I could do without it, even though it does add a little bit of a unique spin to the world, because that's not something you really see a whole lot, at least in a lot of the other fantasy I've read. Granted, that's a lot more modern leaning typically, but still. Another thing that I need to mention as well that I forgot about is the characters. I like the characters in Lord of the Rings. I do think, personally, I like the characters better in the film adaptation, which I still need to watch again because I've only seen it once and it was a few years ago. But I feel like the characters were much more compelling to me in the film than in the book. I still enjoy the characters in the book. I particularly enjoy Gandalf and Sam. I even like Frodo and a lot of the other characters, but they just don't quite really get me into them as much in the book version. That's not a huge issue because I think they're all still good. They're just not as compelling. But I think a big part of that is, in a film, you're actually seeing the actor's performance and, all that kind of thing really adds a lot to the character. So I think that's probably just a difference in the medium. But that pretty much wraps up this review. So really enjoyed this one, definitely. It was a lot of fun to revisit. I'm looking forward to continuing into The Two Towers and Return of the King, which in my memory, I liked those books more than this one. So I'm curious to see if that'll still be the case. As far as a rating that I would give this book, I think I would give it an 8.5 out of 10. Maybe I could be persuaded to do a 9. I could go either way on it, really. But it was just, it was a really good read, but not quite as amazing as I was kind of hoping that it would be. Now that it's been a couple years, I was hoping I'd maybe like it a little more, whereas I liked it about the same level as I did the first time, I think. So I'm curious to see if that'll be the case for the whole trilogy. So that is pretty much it for this review. So let me know in the comments if you have read Fellowship of the Ring, and I'd be quite surprised if you haven't. But if you haven't, then definitely let me know, and I'm curious to hear what you are thinking about this trilogy. And if you have read it, then let me know what you thought as well. And that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.